Imagine looking at a couple of photos, just flat pictures, and trying to picture the whole scene in 3D. What's behind that chair? How solid is that statue? It's a tricky problem.
It really is. And that's basically the core of novel view synthesis, or NVS. Taking a few existing images and trying to create a brand new view, maybe from a totally different angle.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at research tackling a really tough version of this. It's not just about generating the picture from a new viewpoint, but also figuring out the actual 3D shape underneath.
Right, and doing it from just a handful of input images where you don't even know the exact camera positions beforehand, these unposed images. The big challenge they focus on is making this work even for views that are way off from the originals, sort of guessing what's in the parts you couldn't see at all.
Okay, so the specific method we're unpacking today is called MoAI. The paper lays out how it aims to create both the image and the geometry, making sure they match up, and handle these really challenging unseen viewpoints.
Yeah, so we're going to pull apart this paper and see how they tackle it, what the core ideas are.
Before we get to MoAI itself, maybe we should quickly touch on what came before. The paper mentions a few types of NVS methods.
Sure. So you've got what they call feed-forward methods. These are generally pretty good at reconstructing the bits of the scene you can actually see in the input photos.
But they fall down when you ask them to guess what's hidden,
Right.
like extrapolating into the unknown.
Exactly. They struggle with that extrapolation. Then there are generative approaches, often using diffusion models, which can extrapolate, can imagine unseen stuff.
But the paper notes some limits there too, like they might only work well for views kind of similar to the training data.
That's often a limitation, yeah. They might not generalize perfectly to completely new types of views.
Yep.
And a lot of them just give you the image, not the explicit 3D geometry to go with it.
Okay, and one more type mentioned warping and inpainting.
Right. The basic idea there is you estimate some 3D info, warp it to your target view, and then use a model to paint in the gaps. But the researchers here felt that relying mostly on 2D image cues for the inpainting part could cause problems, especially if the viewpoint shift is really large. Things might not line up correctly.
So MoAI builds on that warping and inpainting idea, but does something different.
It does. The key is that it applies this idea to both the image and the geometry at the same time. It's a dual process.
How's that start? You feed it the input images.
Yeah, those unposed reference images. It then uses, like, standard tools. They mention one called VGGT to estimate the camera positions and generate these things called partial 3D point maps for each image.
A point map being like a sparse cloud of 3D points
Yeah.
visible in that specific picture.
That's a good way to put it, just a set of coordinates for visible surfaces. Then it takes all these point maps from the different input views and merges them into one single point cloud for the whole scene.
Okay, got it. Combined, still probably sparse point cloud. Then what?
Then they project that point cloud onto the new viewpoint you actually want to create. So what you get is a starting point, a partial observation of the scene's geometry from your target angle. It's like a geometric scaffold.
So now the problem isn't just reconstruction, it's filling in the blanks. In painting.
Right, but in painting, two things simultaneously. You need to fill in the missing color and texture for the image, and you need to fill in the missing 3D structure for the geometry.
And they use diffusion models for this, UNets.
Yeah, they use UNet architectures, which are pretty standard for this kind of generation task. They cleverly initialize them using pre-trained models like Stable Diffusion for images and another one called Marigold for geometry, and then fine-tune them specifically for this dual in-painting job.
Okay, so two networks, image and geometry, both trying to fill in the missing pieces based on that initial projected point cloud. This sounds like where the main challenge might pop up.
It is. They noticed something important. The geometry completion network and the image in-painting network didn't quite work the same way when faced with large missing regions.
Oh, so?
The geometry completion tended to be, well, more robust, more deterministic. Geometry has rules, right? A surface usually continues smoothly. So even with big gaps, it could often make a reasonable guess about the shape.
Whereas the image network,
Yeah.
more guesswork involved.
A lot more ambiguity, yeah.
Yeah.
What texture should be here, what exact color. The paper even shows an example, I think, where the image model struggles to complete a wheel shape while the geometry model figures out the circle pretty well. There's just less information sometimes in the partial image view.
And this difference in behavior is what led them to their main innovation.
Precisely. This led them to develop what they call cross-modal attention installation, MoAI. That's the core mechanism they propose to make these two networks work together better and keep the results aligned.
Cross-modal attention installation. Okay, what does that actually do?
So inside these UNUCs, there's this attention mechanism. It helps the network figure out which parts of the input are related to which parts of the output it's generating, kind of like spatial awareness. The image network, as it's figuring out colors and textures, develops these attention maps that capture, visual relationships, maybe even some semantic understanding. This bit is part of the roof. That bit is sky.
Okay.
What MoAI does is it takes those spatial attention maps from the image network and literally uses them to replace the corresponding attention maps inside the geometry network.
Huh. So the geometry network uses the image network's attention. Why?
It creates this really interesting synergy. The geometry completion, which is already pretty good at structure, gets guided by the richer, maybe more context-aware attention from the image side. It's like it gets hints about the overall layout and object structure.
And does the image network benefit too?
It does.
Hmm.
Because the geometry network is more constrained, more deterministic about shape, feeding its attention back implicitly through this shared mechanism helps the image network generate visuals that are more consistent with a plausible 3D structure. It kind of reins in the image network's tendency to hallucinate freely in ambiguous areas.
So it's a two-way street, making them both better and ensuring the final image actually matches the generated 3D shape.
Exactly. And they specifically mention that just transferring the attention maps is key, as it avoids sort of crudely mixing features from the two domains, which could cause other problems. It's a targeted way to share structural understanding.
That's clever. But they didn't stop there, did they? There's another issue with the input data itself.
Right. Those initial point clouds you get from the off-the-shelf predictors, they can be noisy, they can have errors, especially when you try to project them to a viewpoint that's really far from where the original photos were taken.
And that noise could mess up the whole generation process later on.
It absolutely could. If your starting geometric scaffold is wonky, the diffusion models might generate strange results trying to follow it.
So how did they make the input geometry more reliable?
They introduced something called proximity-based mesh conditioning. Instead of just using that raw, potentially noisy projected point map.
They turn it into a mesh first, like connecting the dots.
Yeah, pretty much. They use techniques like ball pivoting to convert the point cloud into a mesh, a surface made of connected triangles. This gives a denser, smoother representation before they project it to the target view.
Why is a mesh better here?
Well, it interpolates between the points, so it's less sensitive to individual noisy points. It provides a more complete surface to start from, and they don't just use the mesh shape, they also add depth information and surface normals, basically, which way each triangle is facing.
Ah, so more geometric detail to guide the networks.
Right. And these extra cues, the depth and normals, help the network focus on the more reliable parts of the geometry. They even do something called normal masking.
Which is?
They basically ignore parts of the projected mesh that would be facing away from the new camera view. The idea is that those back-facing surfaces are the most likely ones to be inaccurate since they weren't directly observed in the original photos, so they filter them out.
Okay, so they're really cleaning up and enriching that initial geometric guidance.
Definitely. And this refined mesh data with depth and normals is then used to create conditioning signals for both the image and the geometry diffusion networks, helping them understand the reliable structure they should be building upon.
Makes sense. Was there anything else they did to improve the geometry handling?
Yes. One more technical detail they found helped a lot. Camera space point map normalization.
Okay, what does that mean?
Instead of working with the 3D point coordinates in some global world system, they transform all the coordinates into the local system of the target camera, the view they're trying to synthesize.
So everything is relative to the camera's viewpoint.
Exactly. It simplifies things for the network. It doesn't have to learn about large, absolute positions in space. It just needs to learn the relative geometry between the input views and the target view, all centered around the target camera. They found this made training more stable and improved the geometric consistency of the results quite a bit.
Right, simplifying the learning task.
Right.
Okay, so we have the dual in-painting, the cross-modal attention linking them, and this improved mesh conditioning with normalization. Let's talk results. What did this MoAI framework achieve?
Well, the paper shows pretty strong performance, especially in those tough extrapolation scenarios, creating views very different from the inputs. They benchmarked it on standard datasets like DTU and Real Estate 10K.
And it outperformed previous methods in those cases.
Specifically in extrapolation, yes, the results they present show a clear advantage. It also holds its own in interpolation settings, meaning views between the input ones.
And crucially, it outputs both the image and the geometry aligned.
Yes, that's a key output. You get the novel view image and you get the corresponding 3D geometry, typically as a point cloud, that matches it. They show examples where the generated image textures map cleanly onto the generated 3D shape. It's a complete representation.
Any other interesting capabilities they highlighted?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is zero-shot generalization. They showed it performing well on data sets like DTU, even though it wasn't explicitly trained on that specific data set, which is promising.
And what about the number of input images? Does it need a fixed number?
Interestingly, no. They found that thanks to how it aggregates information using attention, the model could handle different numbers of input views, like 1, 2, 3, or 4, and actually benefit from having more views, even if it was mainly trained on, say, just 2 views. So it seems quite flexible in practice.
That's useful. And did they do tests to show each part was necessary, like the mesh conditioning and the MoAI attention swapping?
Oh, yeah. They included ablation studies. Those basically test the system with different components turned off. And those studies confirm that each piece, the point map guidance, the enhanced mesh conditioning, and the MoAI cross-modal attention, all made a positive difference to the final performance.
Okay, so summing it up, the big achievement here seems to be a system that can take just a few regular photos without precise camera info and generate not only a new view, but also the underlying 3D structure for that view, making sure they match up, and doing it well even for challenging unseen angles.
That's the core contribution, yes. Tackling that joint image and geometry synthesis, particularly for extrapolation.
So maybe the thought to leave people with is, think about what this capability unlocks. If you can automatically generate not just the look, but the shape of a scene from any new angle based on just a few snapshots.
Right, what does that ability to generate aligned image and geometry on the fly mean? How could that change the way we maybe capture environments or share 3D models or interact with virtual representations of the real world? It opens up some interesting possibilities.